Imagine a place so vast, so dense, and so alive that it swallows entire expeditions without a trace. A place where the air is so thick with moisture that breathing feels like drinking, where the canopy above you is so complete that the forest floor lives in a permanent green twilight, even at midday, where the sounds, the cries, the rustles, the clicks, the hums never stop. Not at noon, not at midnight, never. This is the Amazon rainforest. It covers over 5.5 million square kilometers across 9 countries in South America. It is home to more species of plants, insects, fish, birds, and mammals than anywhere else on the planet. 1 in 10 of all known species on Earth lives here. The Amazon River, which winds through its heart, discharges more fresh water into the ocean than any other river in the world. By volume, it accounts for roughly 20% of all the fresh water flowing into the world's oceans. This forest is, quite literally, the lungs and the circulatory system of our planet. But here's the thing about the Amazon that most people don't fully appreciate until they are standing inside it. It is not a park. It is not a wilderness preserve where rangers patrol the paths. It is not a managed forest with trail markers and emergency call boxes. It is one of the most genuinely hostile environments on the surface of the earth, a complex living machine that has had hundreds of millions of years to perfect the art of recycling anything that enters it. Getting lost in the Amazon is not like getting lost in the woods behind your house. It is not even like getting lost in a large national park. When you get lost in the Amazon, you face a convergence of threats so diverse and relentless that it challenges the human body and mind at every possible level, simultaneously. The heat is oppressive, typically above 30 degrees Celsius with humidity that makes those temperatures feel far worse. The insects are everywhere. Mosquitoes carrying malaria and dengue, fire ants that attack in vast coordinated swarms, botflies that lay eggs beneath human skin, snakes, anacondas, fur-de-lances, bushmasters move invisibly through the undergrowth. Caimans wait in the murky shallows of every river crossing. Even the plants fight back. Thorn vines, toxic sap, razor-edged grasses that slice open skin with every step. And yet, people go in. Explorers, adventurers, scientists, families, children. They go in because the Amazon is also irresistibly beautiful, because it holds secrets, ancient ones, because the pull of the unknown is one of the most powerful forces in human nature, and some of them do not come out. Or, if they do, they come out changed in ways that are impossible to fully describe. Today, we are going to tell 5 of those stories, 5 of the most extraordinary accounts of people, from a 17-year-old girl to one of history's greatest explorers who found themselves lost inside the Amazon rainforest. Some of these stories end with miraculous rescue, some end in tragedy, and at least one, the oldest of them all, ends with a question that has never been answered. These are the stories of what it truly means to be lost in the Green Cathedral. It was Christmas Eve, 1971. 17-year-old Julianne Kupka had just received her high school diploma the night before, and she and her mother Maria were finally heading to join her father at the Panguana Research Station deep in the Peruvian Amazon. The flight was supposed to take about an hour. It lasted 25 minutes. The Coapses boarded Lanza Flight 508 at Lima's International Airport. The airline, Lanza, had a notoriously poor safety record. Julianne's father had actually urged his wife not to fly with them, but the airport was packed. Several flights the day before had been canceled, and the Christmas rush had overwhelmed the system. They had no other choice, or so it seemed. 92 people boarded the Lockheed Electra turboprop that afternoon. 25 minutes into the flight, the plane flew directly into a massive thunderstorm over the Peruvian jungle. Julianne would later recall watching lightning play across the clouds outside her window, feeling the turbulence throw the aircraft sideways. Passengers around her began to scream. Then she saw a blinding flash on the left wing. Her mother turned to her and said, very calmly, "That is the end. It's all over." Those were the last words Julianne ever heard her mother speak. A lightning bolt had ignited a fuel tank. The plane began to break apart at 10,000 feet above the rainforest canopy. In the chaos and the noise and the roaring wind, Julian felt herself torn free of the disintegrating fuselage, still strapped into her row of seats, and then she was falling. She was falling from the sky in a spiraling seat through cloud and storm and darkness toward the jungle far below. She would later describe the sensation as strangely peaceful, like floating. She lost consciousness before she hit the canopy. The next morning, Julianne Kupska woke up alone on the floor of the Peruvian Amazon. She had a broken collarbone, a torn knee ligament, a deep gash in her right arm, a concussion that made it difficult to think clearly, and she was the only living person for what she could only assume was many, many miles in every direction. Of the 92 people aboard Lanza Flight 508, she was the only survivor. She had fallen nearly 2 miles from the sky and lived, but surviving the fall was only the beginning. Julianne was a scientist's daughter who had grown up visiting her parents' research station in the jungle. She remembered one piece of advice her father had drilled into her. If you're ever lost, find a stream and follow it downstream. Streams lead to rivers. Rivers lead to people. So she walked. For 11 days, with a broken collarbone and a swelling wound crawling with maggots, which she treated as best she could with petrol she found at an abandoned shelter, she followed the water. She survived on the sweets she had found among the wreckage of the plane. She waded through rivers, past caimans watching from the banks. She endured the insects, the rain, the darkness, the grief, because she knew her mother was dead, because she had found some of the other passengers, dead, still strapped in their seats, having survived the fall but unable to help themselves. She kept walking anyway. On the 11th day, she stumbled upon a small camp used by local workers. She sheltered there overnight. The next morning, the workers found her. She had walked roughly 9 kilometers through one of the most hostile environments on Earth, injured, alone, and grieving, and she had made it. Lanza Flight 508 is now listed in the Guinness World Records as the deadliest aviation accident caused by an in-flight lightning strike. 91 people died that Christmas Eve. Julianne Kupska survived, went on to become a mammologist, and eventually became the director of the very research station she had been traveling to visit when the plane went down. She wrote a memoir about the experience called When I Fell from the Sky. The legendary German filmmaker Werner Herzog was so moved by her story that he made a documentary about it, partly because he himself had been originally booked on that same flight and had only changed his plans at the last moment. There are survival stories, and then there are miracles. Julianne Kupska's story is both. Not every story of being lost in the Amazon ends with rescue. Some end with silence, and perhaps no silence in the history of exploration has been louder or more haunting than the one that swallowed Colonel Percy Fawcett in 1925. Percy Harrison Fawcett was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable explorers of the early 20th century. Born in 1867 in Devon, England, he was a decorated British military officer, a skilled cartographer, and a man of extraordinary physical toughness. Between 1906 and 1924, he led 7 expeditions into the Amazon basin, mapping uncharted territory at the behest of the Royal Geographical Society. He was known to push through conditions that broke other men. He was famously respectful of indigenous peoples at a time when many European explorers were not. He inspired Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to write The Lost World. He is widely believed to be one of the inspirations for Indiana Jones. But Fawcett had an obsession. He had become convinced, through a combination of indigenous legends, ancient manuscripts, and his own increasingly mystical intuition, that somewhere in the depths of the Brazilian jungle, there was a lost city, a great, ancient, pre-Columbian civilization hidden in the forest. He called it Z. In April of 1925, Fawcett set off on what he believed would be his greatest and final expedition. He brought 2 companions, his eldest son, Jack Fawcett, who was 22 years old, and Jack's best friend, Raleigh Rimmel. They departed from Cuiabá in the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso, heading deep into the interior toward the Xingu River Basin, territory that was, at the time, almost entirely unmapped by Europeans. The early weeks of the expedition were brutal. Swarming mosquitoes made sleep difficult and travel miserable. Rimmel's foot became severely swollen from tick bites. Fawcett drove a demanding pace, often 10 to 15 miles per day through dense jungle, with a single-mindedness that worried those who knew him. As they pushed deeper, the guides they had hired grew increasingly frightened. They warned Fawcett about the tribes of the interior. Hostile tribes. Fawcett dismissed the warnings. On the 29th of May, 1925, Percy Fawcett sent his last communication to the outside world. It was a letter to his wife, Nina. In it, he wrote that they were crossing the upper Xingu River and were about to enter territory that, to his knowledge, no European had ever explored. He wrote that their 2 local guides were turning back, too frightened to go further. He wrote, "You need have no fear of failure." Then Percy Fawcett, his son Jack, and their friend Raleigh Rimmel walked into the jungle, and they were never seen again. The mystery of what happened to the Fawcett expedition has consumed explorers, journalists, and historians for the centuries since. Beginning in 1928, no fewer than 13 known search expeditions were launched to find Fawcett or determine his fate. Those searches collectively cost more than 100 additional lives. People died trying to find a man who had died or vanished in the jungle. The theories are numerous. The most widely accepted is that Fawcett and his companions were killed by one of the indigenous tribes whose territory they had entered without invitation or permission. The Kalapalo people, one of the tribes of the Upper Xingu, are believed to have been among the last to see the 3 men alive. Later accounts from Kalapalo elders, gathered by researchers in subsequent decades, suggested that the party had been warned repeatedly to turn back, had refused, and had been seen heading further east, and before the smoke from their campfires was no longer visible on the horizon. Other theories suggest starvation, illness, or becoming irrevocably lost in terrain with no landmarks and no paths. One of the more extraordinary theories, which gained traction in the 1950s, held that Fawcett had deliberately disappeared, that he had found something, or become something in the jungle, and had chosen to stay. There is no evidence for this, but it is the kind of story that the Amazon inspires. There's a postscript to the Fawcett story that gives it an unexpected dimension. In recent decades, archaeologists and geographers using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating survey techniques have found extraordinary evidence in the Amazon basin, evidence of ancient, sophisticated civilizations that were far more complex than anyone previously believed. There were cities, there were roads, and earthworks on a massive scale. The Amazon was not, as colonial Europeans assumed, an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was a place where millions of people lived in organized societies for thousands of years before European disease and conquest destroyed them. Was Fawcett right? Not precisely, perhaps, but he was not entirely wrong either. The jungle held something ancient and extraordinary. He went looking for it and never came back, and the Amazon kept it secret. In 1981, a 22-year-old Israeli named Yossi Ginsberg arrived in La Paz, Bolivia, with a backpack, some savings, and a hunger for adventure so intense it bordered on recklessness. He had just finished 3 years of mandatory service in the Israeli Navy, and, like many young Israelis after their military service, he had set off to travel the world. But Yossi didn't want typical backpacker destinations. He wanted the real thing. He wanted the Amazon. In a hostel in La Paz, he met a man named Karl Ruprechter, an Austrian who claimed to be a geologist and an expert on the Bolivian jungle. Ruprechter told Yossi about a remote tribe he had visited deep in the forest, about unmapped rivers, about villages untouched by modernity. He offered to take Yossi there. Yossi was transfixed. He later admitted, "He saw how I drank up every word he said. I was naive and begged him to take me with him." Yossi recruited 2 more travelers, Marcus Stam, a Swiss school teacher, and Kevin Gale, an American photographer. Together, the 4 of them loaded their backpacks and followed Karl Ruprechter into the Bolivian jungle. The Bolivians they met along the way warned them repeatedly not to go. They went anyway, Almost immediately, the cracks in Ruprechter's story began to show. His maps were hand-drawn and often inaccurate. The tribe he had promised to take them to seemed to recede further and further with every day of walking. The jungle closed in around them. After weeks of grueling travel, with the group weakening and Marcus developing painful foot problems that made walking agonizing, they made a desperate decision. They would split up. Ruprechter and Marcus would try to walk out overland, while Yossi and Kevin would take a raft down the Tweetchie River to the nearest town. Neither plan went well. Marcus and Carl were never seen again. To this day, their fates remain unknown. They are assumed to have died in the jungle. For Yossi and Kevin, the raft seemed like the quicker, safer option. It was neither. The Tweetchie River became increasingly violent. The current was fast and treacherous, and the raft was constantly at risk of capsizing in the rapids. Then, approaching a particularly violent stretch of white water, more waterfall than river, the raft was destroyed. Kevin managed to swim to the bank. Yossi was swept downstream and over the falls, and when Kevin finally found a bank to stand on and looked back, there was no sign of his friend. Yossi Ginsberg was alone in the Bolivian Amazon. He had no food, no tools, no map. He was soaking wet in a jungle that, despite its heat, turns bitterly cold at night. And for the next 19 days, he fought to survive. What followed was one of the most extraordinary accounts of solo jungle survival ever recorded. He was nearly swallowed by quicksand. Twice. He was attacked by a swarm of army ants that covered his body in a living carpet, tearing at his eyelids and burrowing into his ears and hair, leaving him bloody and trembling. He endured a flash flood that swept him through the forest, tumbling through trees and undergrowth. His feet developed a severe fungal infection that made every step feel like walking on razors. He hallucinated from hunger and fever. He later described seeing a beautiful woman walking beside him through the trees, a presence he became convinced was protecting him. He ate whatever he could find, palm hearts, small fruits, insects. He drank from streams. He used a piece of plastic sheeting he had in his pack to shelter from the rain. He kept moving, always moving, because movement was the only thing standing between him and the jungle's extraordinary patience. On the 19th day, Kevin Gale, who had managed to reach safety and had refused to give up on his friend, returned with a group of Bolivian men on a small boat. They had already covered enormous distances of river, searching for any sign of Yossi. They were about to turn back, but the river was too narrow to turn the boat around at that particular spot. They were forced to pull to the bank to maneuver, and that bank, of all the hundreds of miles of riverbank in the Bolivian Amazon, happened to be exactly where Yossi Ginsberg had collapsed unconscious. He was barely alive. He was found just in time. Yossi himself has described the rescue as nothing less than a miracle, an intervention too precisely timed to be written off as coincidence. He wrote a memoir about his experience, and in 2017 it was turned into a film called Jungle, starring Daniel Radcliffe as Yossi. He returned to Bolivia, helped establish an eco-lodge near where he had nearly died, and has spent decades since talking about what surviving the Amazon taught him about resilience, willpower, and what the human mind is capable of when pushed to its absolute edge. As for Karl Ruprechter, the mysterious Austrian guide who started it all, his true identity was later called into question. Some investigators believed his name was false. His background as a geologist was never verified. What he was really doing in the jungle and what ultimately happened to him and Marcus Stam has never been established. The Amazon took them, and it kept them. Of all the stories in this essay, this is the one that the world watched happen in real time. And of all the stories, it may be the one that is hardest to believe, even as you are watching it unfold. On the 1st of May, 2023, a small Cessna 206 aircraft took off from the Colombian Amazon carrying a woman named Magdalena Mukutui Valencia and her 4 children. The oldest was Leslie, 13 years old, then Solaney, 9, then Tien Noriel, 4, and then Kristen, 11 months old, a baby. They were flying from the Araraquara community toward the town of San Jose del Guaviare. The family was part of the Witoto people, an indigenous community of the Colombian Amazon. Midway through the flight, the engine failed. The plane went down into the jungle. Rescue teams could not reach the crash site for more than 2 weeks because of the dense forest and difficult terrain. When Colombian soldiers finally arrived on May 16th, they found the wreckage. They found the bodies of the pilot, another adult, and Magdalena Mukutui Valencia, the children's mother. But of the 4 children, there was no sign, except a baby bottle, a tiny pair of shoes, and small footprints leading away from the wreckage. The children had walked away from the crash, into the jungle, alone. What followed was a 40-day search operation that gripped Colombia and eventually the entire world. The Colombian military deployed hundreds of soldiers and volunteers. Indigenous trackers from multiple communities joined the search. People who had grown up in this forest and knew its rhythms and its paths. Aircraft dropped food parcels and audio recordings of the children's grandmother calling out to them in their native language, begging them to come out. The operation was given a name, Operation Hope. For 40 days, they found nothing. Then, occasionally, they found traces, a makeshift shelter, some chewed fruit seeds, footprints. The children were alive and they were moving. But why weren't they coming forward when rescuers came near? It was later understood that the children, hearing unknown voices and seeing armed soldiers in military uniforms, had hidden. They had learned from their indigenous upbringing to be cautious of strangers in the forest. So they hid in tree trunks and under undergrowth, even as rescue teams passed within meters of them. On the 9th of June, 2023, 40 days after the plane crash, a combined team of indigenous volunteers and soldiers found the 4 children huddled together in the jungle, just under 5 kilometers from the wreckage. They were thin, they were dehydrated, they had insect bites covering their bodies, but they were alive, all 4 of them, including 11-month-old Kristen. The baby was alive. How had they survived? Leslie, the 13-year-old, was the key. As the eldest, she had taken charge from the very beginning. She had pulled her baby sister from the wreckage after the crash, spotting Kristen's foot sticking out from the debris. She had used the cassava flour and water that the family had brought on the plane to feed the infant. She had found and eaten fruits in the forest. Knowledge of which ones were safe to eat had been passed down to her through years of life in an indigenous community that had lived in the Amazon for centuries. She had built shelters with a plastic tarp and a mosquito net from the plane. She had kept her siblings calm and moving and fed and alive for 40 days. The Colombian president Gustavo Petro called them children of the jungle. A photographer involved in the search said something even more profound, that the children were not, in any meaningful sense, lost. They were in their natural environment. The forest, in a way, was home. They had the knowledge passed down through generations of indigenous peoples who had thrived in the Amazon for millennia to not merely survive, but to navigate. There is a coda to this story that adds a layer of complexity and sadness. It later emerged that the family had been fleeing threats from armed guerrilla groups in the region at the time of the flight, and investigations after the rescue led to serious and deeply troubling allegations about one of the children's fathers, resulting in criminal charges. The children, after their rescue, were placed in state care. Their extraordinary survival became entangled with an entirely different kind of danger, one the jungle could not have prepared them for. Their story is, ultimately, about far more than 40 days in the Amazon. But those 40 days remain something almost beyond comprehension. A 13-year-old girl with a 4-year-old and a baby in her arms, deep in the Colombian rainforest, kept everyone alive. We return for our final story to Bolivia, and to a survival account so extreme in its duration and its physical cost that if it had been presented as fiction, it would have been dismissed as too implausible. On January 25th, 2023, a 30-year-old Bolivian man named Jonathan Acosta went on a hunting trip with 4 friends into the Amazon jungle in the Baures region of Beni, one of the most remote departments in Bolivia. It was supposed to be a short trip, a few days, perhaps a week. They knew the area broadly and they had a plan. Somehow, the exact details were never fully established. Jonathan became separated from his group. Maybe he followed an animal deeper into the forest. Maybe the group moved and he didn't hear them. The jungle absorbed him. And then, for 31 days, Jonathan Acosta was alone. 31 days. To put that in perspective, Yossi Ginsberg, whose story we have just told, survived 19 days alone in the Amazon. And that story became a book, a documentary, and a Hollywood film. 31 days is a duration that the human body is not designed to endure in conditions like these without extraordinary resourcefulness and equally extraordinary luck. What Jonathan did to survive belongs in the same category as the most extreme survival accounts ever documented. He ate insects, worms, whatever he could find on the forest floor and in the undergrowth. He collected water in his boots when it rained, then drank it. When there was no water from rain, he drank his own urine to stay hydrated. He was attacked by animals. He described encounters with wild animals that left him injured and terrified. He used knowledge of basic survival techniques he had accumulated over a lifetime of living in proximity to the jungle. Search and rescue teams had been looking for him since his family reported him missing at the end of January. But the Amazon does not give up its secrets easily. For over a month, the jungle hid him. Not because Jonathan was still and waiting to be found. He was moving, desperately trying to navigate back toward the world, but because the Amazon is simply that large and that dense and that indifferent. On February 26th, 31 days after he walked into the jungle, local volunteers found Jonathan Acosta alive. He was severely dehydrated. He could barely stand. He had lost significant weight, but he was breathing. He was conscious. He was, somehow, alive. When he was reunited with his family, he told journalists, "I am very happy and grateful." Those words, so simple, so quietly enormous, say everything. Jonathan's account attracted the attention of survival experts who noted that, if verified in its details, his ordeal would make him one of the longest surviving lone Amazon survivors ever recorded. His story did not become a film. It did not become a best-selling book. It was reported in the news for a few days, and then the world moved on, as it always does. But the 31 days he spent inside the Amazon, alone, without food, without tools, without anyone coming, deserve to be remembered. Because they represent something true and important about what human beings are capable of when there is absolutely no other option. He said it was survival knowledge that saved him. Knowing to drink urine when there was no water. Knowing to eat insects when there was no food. Knowing, above all, to keep moving. To keep existing. To refuse, stubbornly and irrationally and wonderfully, to die. 5 stories. 5 sets of people. A teenage girl, a Victorian-era explorer, a young Israeli backpacker, 4 indigenous children, and a Bolivian hunter who all found themselves, for wildly different reasons, lost inside the same impossible place. What do these stories tell us? They tell us, first of all, that the Amazon is exactly as dangerous as it has always been described. The threats are real. The distances are real. The isolation is real. When the jungle wants to keep you, it is extraordinarily good at doing so. It has had a very long time to practice, but they also tell us something else. Something about the specific texture of human survival, about what it requires and what it reveals. Julian Kupka survived because she remembered advice, because she had grown up around the jungle and trusted it enough to follow a stream through it for 11 days. Yossi Ginsberg survived because he refused to accept that he was going to die, even on the days when his body was failing and his mind was fragmenting. The Huitoto children survived because of knowledge that stretched back centuries, passed from elders to parents to a 13-year-old girl who used it in the worst possible circumstances to keep an infant alive for 40 days. Jonathan Acosta survived because he knew that survival knowledge, however unpleasant its application, was more powerful than despair. And Percy Fawcett did not survive, or at least he almost certainly did not, though we will never know for certain. And his story tells us something different. Something about the cost of obsession and about the way the Amazon does not distinguish between the foolish and the brave, the visionary and the reckless. It swallows them all equally. There's also something in these stories about the Amazon itself, about what it means for a place like this to exist on our planet. The children of the Huitoto people were not helpless in the jungle because it was, in some profound sense, theirs. Indigenous peoples have lived in the Amazon for tens of thousands of years. They did not survive it through luck. They survived it through relationship, a deep, specific, accumulated knowledge of how to live inside an ecosystem rather than against it. That knowledge is one of the greatest inheritances of human civilization, and it is disappearing, along with the forest itself, at a rate that should terrify us all. The Amazon rainforest is shrinking. Deforestation, agricultural expansion, fire, and climate change are eating away at its edges and burning through its interior at an unprecedented pace. The forest that swallowed Percy Fawcett whole in 1925 is smaller today than it has been at any point in the last 50 million years. Scientists warn that if deforestation continues at its current rate, the Amazon could reach a tipping point within decades, a point at which enough forest has been destroyed that the entire ecosystem begins an irreversible collapse, transforming itself from rainforest into savanna, the lungs of the planet, going still. The stories we have told today are, on one level, individual human dramas, stories of courage and terror and miraculous survival, but they are also collectively a reminder of something larger. The Amazon is not a backdrop. It is not a setting. It is a living entity of staggering complexity and importance, an entity that has been here for far longer than our species and that holds within it more mystery, more life, more ancient knowledge than we will ever fully understand. The people in these stories were lost in the Amazon, but perhaps the more urgent question, the one that should follow us as we close the chapter on these extraordinary tales, is whether we are losing the Amazon. Because some things, once lost, cannot be rescued. Some things you cannot follow a stream to find. Some things, once gone, are simply gone. And that silence would be louder than anything.